Sunday matinee at
Right.
the Pantages.
Right.
And we took our plane. We had to do it privately, and went to Philadelphia.
He was once one of Hollywood's biggest stars, loved by millions and celebrated on screen. But behind the fame, there's a story that almost no one talks about. Mickey Rooney's personal life wasn't just complicated, it was surrounded by controversy, failed marriages, and choices that still spark debate today. So what really happened behind closed doors, and how did it all spiral so far? Join us as we uncover the untold story, the Hollywood machine. From the late 1920s to the early 1960s, Hollywood was controlled by a system that gave enormous power to movie studios and almost no freedom to actors. This period became known as the studio system era. 5 studios dominated the industry: Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, Paramount Pictures, 20th Century Fox, and RKO Pictures. These companies did not just make movies. They controlled theaters, distribution, publicity, and the careers of nearly every major actor in America. Actors signed contracts that often lasted 7 years. Once signed, the studio controlled almost every part of their lives. Studios decided what actors wore, how they spoke, who they dated, and what kind of public image they would have. If a star gained weight, got into trouble, or started a relationship the studio disliked, executives stepped in immediately. Morality clauses were common, and these clauses allowed studios to punish or suspend actors whose behavior could damage the company's image. Public relations departments worked constantly to protect stars and hide scandals. If an actor was arrested, had an affair, or caused controversy, studios often buried the story before it reached newspapers. Reporters who cooperated received exclusive interviews and access to celebrities. Those who refused could lose access completely. Studios also used lawyers to pressure actors into silence. Many performers feared losing their contracts, their income, and their reputations if they challenged powerful executives. Child stars were especially vulnerable because they grew up inside this system before they fully understood it. They were taught that the studio always came first. Many spent more time on sets than in school and were surrounded by adults who treated them like products instead of children. That environment shaped Mickey Rooney from a very young age. By the late 1930s, Rooney had become MGM's biggest star and one of the highest-paid actors in the world. His Andy Hardy films made millions of dollars, and studio head Louis B. Mayer saw him as a financial goldmine. Because Rooney earned so much money for MGM, the studio protected him constantly. His behavior was excused, his scandals were softened, and his success gave him power very few young people could handle responsibly. Hollywood did not simply ignore Mickey Rooney's behavior later in life. The system helped build the mindset that fame placed him above consequences. And as Rooney's fame grew bigger, so did the damage he left behind. The child star. Long before Mickey Rooney became one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, he was a little boy named Joe Yule Jr., who grew up in a world where performing was not a choice. It was his entire life from the moment he could walk. His mother, Nell Carter, was a struggling vaudeville entertainer who spent years traveling from town to town, doing comedy sketches and stage acts. She was married to Joe Yule Sr., another performer whose drinking and unstable behavior created constant problems at home. Their marriage was difficult, filled with financial stress and personal conflict, and eventually ended in divorce. After the separation, Nell focused all her energy on her young son. She believed he could become the success she never achieved herself. Even before Joe Jr. could properly speak, she placed him into performances. Audiences loved seeing a tiny child sing, dance, and imitate adults on stage. The attention convinced Nell that her son could become a star if she pushed hard enough. With almost no money, Nell moved to Hollywood in the 1920s, hoping to get her son into films. At the time, Hollywood was growing rapidly, and studios were constantly searching for fresh faces. After many rejections, Joe finally landed a role in the Mickey Maguire comedy shorts. He was only 6 years old. Those short films became popular, and suddenly the child was no longer just helping his mother survive. He was supporting the household financially. The schedule was exhausting for someone so young. He spent long hours on set almost every day, memorizing lines, filming scenes, and performing for adults who treated him like a professional employee instead of a child. California had very weak child labor protections at the time, so studios could work children for extremely long hours without serious restrictions. There was little concern for education, emotional health, or normal childhood development. For Joe, school, friendships, and free time became secondary to making movies. When Louis B. Mayer and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer signed him to a major contract, they decided the name Joe Yule Jr. did not sound marketable enough. MGM rebranded him as Mickey Rooney, creating a completely new public identity for him while he was still a teenager. From that point forward, the studio carefully shaped his image, career, and public behavior. Nell Carter became extremely controlling over every part of Mickey's career because she feared Hollywood would discard him the moment he stopped being profitable. She pushed him constantly, managed his money, monitored his schedule, and stayed deeply involved in his business decisions. But as Mickey became richer and more powerful, he began resenting her control. Eventually, after reaching major success, he fired his own mother as his manager and distanced himself from her publicly. Rooney rarely acknowledged the sacrifices Nell made to build his career. That emotional separation became important later in his life. Growing up as a child, Starr taught him that attention meant value, power meant survival, and relationships often existed to serve his needs. Many of the behaviors that later damaged his marriages and personal life were rooted in the childhood Hollywood created for him. And once Mickey Rooney became Hollywood's favorite young star, the women around him would begin paying the price for it. Norma Shearer. Before Mickey Rooney became known for failed marriages and personal scandals, there was already a pattern forming behind the scenes in Hollywood. One of the earliest women connected to that pattern was Norma Shearer, a woman who had once been one of the most powerful actresses in the film industry. During the 1920s and early 1930s, Norma Shearer was at the top of Hollywood. She was elegant, respected, and hugely successful at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. She won an Academy Award and starred in some of the studio's biggest productions. Much of her influence came from her marriage to producer Irving Thalberg, who was considered one of the smartest and most powerful men in Hollywood. Thalberg helped shape MGM into a major force in filmmaking, and together he and Norma formed one of the industry's most important couples. But everything changed when Thalberg died suddenly in 1936 at only 37 years old. His death left Norma emotionally devastated and politically exposed inside MGM. Without her husband protecting her position, she became vulnerable to the growing authority of studio boss Louis B. Mayer. Mayer now had greater control over MGM, and actresses like Norma depended on his approval to remain valuable to the studio. Around this time, Rooney was becoming MGM's biggest young star. In 1938, he reportedly crossed paths with Norma during studio productions. Rooney was only around 18 years old while Norma was nearly 40, creating a relationship that would have caused major scandal if exposed publicly. Even though Norma was older and established, public opinion at the time would not have protected her. Hollywood often celebrated young male stars for relationships and affairs, while women faced harsh judgment and humiliation. That imbalance created fear. Rooney was the studio's golden boy and one of MGM's biggest moneymakers. Norma understood that rejecting him or causing conflict could damage her already unstable position at the studio. Rumors of their relationship allegedly remained hidden because both parties knew the consequences would fall mostly on her, not him. As gossip quietly spread inside MGM, Mayer reportedly confronted Norma rather than Rooney. That moment reflected the double standard that dominated Hollywood during the studio era. Rooney's behavior could be dismissed with phrases like, "Boys will be boys," while female stars were expected to behave perfectly at all times. Women carried the burden of protecting the studio's image, even when men played equal or greater roles in scandals. For Norma, the situation became a painful realization that her status in Hollywood was never truly secure. Her fame, awards, and influence only mattered as long as the studio found her useful. Once she became vulnerable or inconvenient, that protection weakened quickly. Not long afterward, Norma largely stepped away from acting. Officially, her retirement was presented as a personal decision, but many historians believe changing studio politics and shifting priorities at MGM played a major role. The relationship also revealed an early pattern in Rooney's behavior. He used charm to draw people in, secrecy to protect himself, and emotional pressure to maintain control, and then moved on once the relationship became complicated. And Norma Shearer would not be the last woman to discover how dangerous Mickey Rooney's charm could become. Ava Gardner. When Ava Gardner first arrived in Hollywood, she was just a teenager with no power, no reputation, and no idea how the studio system worked. She had been signed by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer after being discovered for her striking looks. But at that point, she was still very new, still learning how to act, and still trying to understand the fast, controlled world she had entered. Around the same time, Mickey Rooney was already one of MGM's biggest stars. He had fame, money, and influence far beyond his age. When he saw Ava at studio events and around the lot, he reportedly became very interested in her quickly. He pursued her aggressively during her early years at MGM, even though she was still very young and still adjusting to life in Hollywood. In that studio environment, powerful male stars often had access to young actresses in ways that were rarely questioned. Their relationship moved fast. In 1942, they got married in a whirlwind decision that surprised many people inside the studio. It looked sudden from the outside, but in reality, it was shaped by pressure, fame, and the intense Hollywood environment they both lived in. Rooney was already a major star, and Ava was still trying to establish herself. But once they were married, the relationship quickly became uneven. Rooney did not treat Ava as an equal partner. Instead, he often treated her more like a symbol of status. Being married to a rising young actress added to his public image, but behind closed doors, the relationship was much more complicated. Ava later described how charm could be used in a harmful way. She explained that charm was not always about kindness or love, but sometimes about control and influence over another person. Rooney also showed a pattern of needing control over women in his life, especially when they began gaining independence or attention of their own. As Ava started to grow more confident and more recognized in Hollywood, tension increased. Rooney reportedly struggled with jealousy and discomfort whenever his partners were not focused entirely on him or when they started building their own careers and identity. The marriage did not last long. After only about a year, it collapsed completely. The separation was fast, but it reflected deeper problems that had been building from the start. Ava Gardner was still very young, but she made the decision to leave before the situation became even more damaging or controlling. After the divorce, Ava began speaking more openly about what she had learned from the experience. She later described her early relationship with Rooney as a lesson in understanding people who use charm as a form of control. That insight stayed with her as she went on to become one of Hollywood's biggest stars on her own terms. Meanwhile, Rooney's public image remained largely intact. On screen, he was still seen as the energetic, lovable Hollywood star. But behind the scenes, stories about his personal relationships were becoming more complicated. People inside the industry began to see a difference between his public personality and the way he behaved in private relationships. This gap between image and reality would only grow wider in the years that followed. And soon, another young star would enter his life. But this time, the situation would become far more disturbing. Elizabeth Taylor and MGM silence. When Elizabeth Taylor rose to fame in national velvet, she was just a child suddenly placed at the center of Hollywood attention. At only 12 years old, she became one of the most recognizable young stars working at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The studio promoted her as a gifted, graceful talent, and she quickly became one of MGM's most valuable young actresses. During this time, Mickey Rooney was already one of the studio's biggest names. He was older, more experienced, and widely celebrated across Hollywood. Inside the studio system, it was common for major male stars to take on informal mentor roles with younger actors, especially girls who were new to the industry. Rooney was often seen around MGM sets and is described in some accounts as being friendly and supportive toward young performers, including Taylor. However, the environment at MGM was not built to protect young actors in a modern sense. It was a system focused on output, reputation, and profit. Powerful stars were protected, and studios worked hard to maintain clean public images. This meant inappropriate behavior from major actors was often minimized, ignored, or quietly handled behind closed doors, rather than addressed openly. Some later accounts and allegations have suggested that boundaries were crossed during interactions between adult actors and younger performers on studio lots. One widely discussed claim involves an incident in a private trailer that was later interrupted by Rooney's wife at the time, Betty Jane Baker, who was pregnant during that period. According to these accounts, the situation caused emotional distress and contributed to the breakdown of trust in the marriage. However, it is important to note that many details surrounding these claims are disputed and have never been formally verified in public records. What is clearer is the emotional toll the Hollywood environment placed on everyone involved. Betty Jane Baker, already in a vulnerable state due to pregnancy, was reportedly devastated by what she believed she had witnessed. In many studio-era cases, instead of open accountability, studios relied on private settlements and legal agreements to keep scandals from becoming public. NDAs and financial arrangements were often used to prevent actors or spouses from speaking openly about internal conflicts or misconduct allegations. At the same time, young actresses like Taylor were expected to continue working and maintain professionalism regardless of what they experienced behind the scenes. The culture of silence was strong, and speaking out could mean losing roles, being labeled difficult, or even ending a career before it fully began. This created an environment where fear often replaced accountability. Despite the growing complexity of Rooney's personal life, his professional career continued without major interruption during this period. He remained a bankable star for MGM, and his public image stayed largely intact. The studio had strong incentives to protect him because of the revenue he generated. Later in life, Taylor would speak in general terms about how early fame exposed her to adult behavior, and how quickly she became aware that powerful people could harm others and avoid consequences. Her reflections highlighted a broader truth about Hollywood at the time. Protection was often reserved for the most profitable stars, not the most vulnerable people. This contrast between public image and private reality defined much of Rooney's peak years in Hollywood, and it set the stage for even darker chapters ahead. And what happened next would push that pattern even further into the open. 8 wives, gambling, and affairs. As Mickey Rooney grew older, his personal life became increasingly unstable, and his pattern of relationships started repeating in a clear cycle. Over the years, he was married 8 times, and each relationship followed a similar path of intense beginnings, emotional conflict, and eventual breakdown. One of his early marriages was to Betty Jane Baker. At first, the relationship looked promising, but it quickly became strained. The situation became even more difficult when she was pregnant with their second child. The pressure of fame, financial stress, and personal conflict built up, and the marriage ended in divorce while she was still expecting. It was one of the first public signs that Rooney struggled to maintain stability in his family life. Another marriage, to actress Martha Vickers, brought more serious accusations. Vickers later described Rooney as controlling and emotionally harsh. She also spoke about his drinking and how it affected their home life. According to her accounts, arguments were frequent, and the relationship became increasingly difficult to manage. The marriage ended after about 2 years, with Vickers citing cruelty as a major reason for the separation. A major factor in Rooney's personal instability was his compulsive gambling. Over time, gambling became more than a habit. It became a serious addiction. He reportedly lost large amounts of money, sometimes in single nights at the track or card tables. These losses did not just affect him. They directly impacted his family. Bills went unpaid, savings disappeared, and financial security was constantly at risk. His fourth wife, Elaine Devery, later described Rooney as deeply insecure and constantly in need of attention. She said he could be charming and engaging in public, but at home, he often struggled with emotional control and consistency. According to her reflections, his need for validation was constant, and it shaped many of his decisions, both personal and financial. Rooney's gambling debts also created hidden pressure inside his marriages. He often owed money to casinos, bookmakers, and private lenders. Instead of confronting the issue openly, he sometimes tried to hide the scale of his financial problems. This secrecy made trust difficult and added stress to already strained relationships. In many cases, when things fell apart, Rooney would shift blame onto his wives. He sometimes suggested that they were responsible for the financial strain or emotional problems in the marriage, even when his own actions, gambling, affairs, or instability were central to the breakdown. This pattern repeated across multiple relationships. Behind his public image as a talented, energetic entertainer, Rooney's private life was far more unstable. The emotional contrast between his on-screen personality and his home life became more noticeable over time. People who worked with him often saw a cheerful performer, but his families experienced something very different. The cycle became predictable. Strong charm at the beginning, fast-moving relationships, marriage, growing control issues, emotional tension, and eventual collapse. This pattern repeated so often that it became a defining feature of his personal life rather than an exception. His inability to maintain long-term relationships had a lasting impact not only on his wives, but also on his children. Many of them grew up in unstable environments, dealing with financial uncertainty, emotional distance, and the consequences of repeated family breakdowns. And as his personal life continued to unravel, an even darker chapter connected to his marriages was still ahead. Carolyn Mitchell. Carolyn Mitchell entered Mickey Rooney's life as a former Miss Alabama and a devoted mother who was trying to build a stable family life. On the surface, she represented calm and responsibility compared to the chaos that often surrounded Rooney's career. She focused on raising their children and maintaining a home, even as Rooney's fame, addictions, and personal struggles continued to grow more serious. As time passed, the pressure inside the marriage increased. Rooney's gambling problems and emotional instability often pulled him away from his family. He would be absent for long periods, miss important family moments, and make promises that were not always kept. Alongside these issues, allegations of infidelity began to surface, creating even more tension in the relationship. Carolyn eventually began to suspect that something deeper was wrong. When she discovered signs of an affair involving Marge Lane, she confronted Rooney. He denied the claims, but her doubts only grew stronger. Not satisfied with his answers, Carolyn hired a private investigator to find the truth. The investigation reportedly confirmed her fears, and it became a turning point in the marriage. After learning the extent of the situation, Carolyn filed for divorce. This decision marked the beginning of a very difficult separation, not only emotionally, but also socially. During this time, another figure from her past re-entered her life, Milos Milosevic, a stuntman who had once been close to her. Their reconnection happened during a period when Carolyn was vulnerable and going through a painful breakup. The situation escalated when Carolyn met Milos at a diner to talk. What started as a conversation about her personal life turned tense when she openly discussed Rooney's affair and the woman involved. According to accounts of the incident, this revelation triggered a violent reaction from Milos. In a shocking moment of rage, he fatally shot Carolyn in public. Her death sent shockwaves through those who knew her and left her 4 children without a mother. The impact on the family was immediate and devastating. The children were left to grow up with emotional trauma and without the stability their mother had worked so hard to provide. In the aftermath, there were additional claims and speculation surrounding Rooney's relationship with Marge Lane. Some accounts suggested that their relationship had begun before Carolyn's death, although details remain disputed and heavily debated. What is clear is that only a few months after Carolyn's funeral, Rooney married Marge Lane. The timing of this decision caused public outrage and deepened criticism of his personal life. Despite the controversy, Hollywood largely remained silent. Rooney continued to work and maintain his public career, while the private pain experienced by Carolyn's family remained outside the spotlight. Many years later, Kelly Rooney, one of Carolyn's children, spoke openly about her father's emotional absence and selfish behavior, describing a childhood marked by instability and neglect. Carolyn Mitchell's death remains one of the most painful and controversial chapters connected to Rooney's personal history. It represents not just a family tragedy, but also the emotional fallout that surrounded his relationships and choices. And after this moment, his later years would bring an entirely different kind of downfall that no one expected: the collapse of Mickey. After serving in World War II, Mickey Rooney came back to Hollywood expecting to continue exactly where he left off, as one of the biggest stars in the world. During the late 1930s and early 1940s, he had been a top box office name, especially through his work at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. But when he returned, Hollywood had changed quickly, and Rooney had not changed with it. The biggest problem was that audiences had moved on from the type of roles that made him famous. His early success came from youthful, energetic characters, but as he aged, he struggled to transition into serious adult leading man roles. Even though he was an adult in real life, his small frame and youthful face made it difficult for casting directors to see him as a dramatic lead. Hollywood at the time was also shifting toward darker, more complex stories, and Rooney's style no longer fit the industry's new direction. As a result, his box office power began to decline through the late 1940s and 1950s. Fewer major studios were willing to place him at the center of big-budget films. Instead, he began appearing in smaller productions and later moved into television work, which was becoming more popular but paid far less than his peak film contracts. With his career shrinking, financial pressure increased. Rooney had earned millions during his peak years, but much of that money was already gone due to spending, poor management, and ongoing gambling problems. As income slowed, his gambling addiction reportedly became more intense. He continued to lose large sums of money, which created constant financial instability in his life. And as his later years arrived, his story would take yet another unexpected turn that no one saw coming: elder abuse. In the final years of his life, Mickey Rooney was no longer the powerful Hollywood star he once was. He was elderly, fragile, and living in a situation that later raised serious concerns about control and exploitation. Reports emerged that his financial affairs were being managed by his stepson and other family members, and over time, questions were raised about whether he was being taken advantage of. Allegations surfaced that Rooney's money was being misused and that he had very little control over his own finances. Some claims also included physical intimidation, suggesting that he felt unsafe or pressured in his own home. These concerns became more serious when a social worker noticed bruises on his arms during a routine visit. That moment triggered a formal investigation into his well-being. For the first time in his life, Rooney publicly spoke about being mistreated. This was a major shift for someone who had spent decades in the public eye, but rarely discussed personal suffering in an open way. The situation eventually led him to give emotional testimony before the United States Senate in 2011, where he spoke about elder abuse and financial exploitation. During the hearing, Rooney described how he had worked his entire life, earned millions of dollars, and trusted those close to him to manage his affairs. Instead, he said he felt taken advantage of and left without proper control over his own resources. His testimony was emotional and direct, and it caught national attention. Many people were shocked to see a Hollywood legend speaking so openly about vulnerability and abuse at such an advanced age. Mickey Rooney died in 2014 at the age of 93. His death closed a long and complicated life story, but it did not fully settle the public debate about who he was, what he experienced, and what he left behind. And even today, his life still raises one final question about how history should remember him. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more untold Hollywood stories you won't hear anywhere else.